So our next speaker is Adrian Johnston. It's a pleasure to welcome him again here in Ljubljana. I think Adrian is well known in Ljubljana, so he's the sort of a person, you know, he doesn't need an introduction special, so author of several books on Lacan and psychoanalysis, Badiou, and we're kind of late, so just the floor is yours.
Without further ado.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I will briefly say that it is a pure joy to be back in Ljubljana with so many friends, and also to have had the opportunity already to meet new people and make additional friends. I will not waste any time, given that we're running a little behind, so let me get underway. My talk today examines money as it features in both Marxism and psychoanalysis. Of course, money is the epitome of Marx's fetishized commodity. And in Marxist discussions of the connected topics of currency and commodity fetishism, as reliant mainly on Capital Volume 1, it often is left underappreciated that such fetishism reaches its apotheosis only with the development of quote-unquote interest-bearing capital, hereafter IBC, that is, with the emergence of fictitious finance capital in the guises of credit, banking, etc., as dealt with in Capital Volume 3. Herein I perform two complementary gestures, one as regards Marxism and another with respect to psychoanalysis. Apropos Marxism, I counterbalance the usual long-standing emphasis on commodity fetishism as per the first volume of Das Kapital, with a foregrounding of this fetishism as per the third volume. Apropos psychoanalysis, I shift away from its traditional fixation on reducing financial matters to libidinal contents. I explore instead the implications of the forms of capitalist fetishism for reconsidering the forms of intrasubjective defense mechanisms. This leads me to posit a complementary inversion of Lacan's dictum, according to which repression is always the return of the repressed. The return of the repressed sometimes is the most effective repression. To pose a rhetorical question paraphrasing Brecht, what is the laundering of money compared with the laundering that is money? Marx's A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy contains a discussion foreshadowing his subsequent explicit introduction in the first volume of Capital of the concept of commodity fetishism as a real abstraction in which relations between persons really are transformed into relations between things. This 1859 moment, strikingly anticipating 1867's The Fetishism of the Commodity and Its Secret, speaks regarding money of, quote, this perverted appearance, this prosaically real and by no means imaginary mystification, end quote. Marx thereby foregrounds the material objectivity over and above the subjective ideality of the ideology of commodity fetishism. For instance, a Marxist theoretician intimately familiar with the fetishism of the commodity and its secret, but living surrounded by capitalism, might subjectively be under no illusions about the true nature of the commodities confronting him or her in the quotidian consumer marketplaces he or she frequents. Nonetheless, insofar as this enlightened cynic still is compelled to participate in the material reality of purchasing and consuming within capitalism's spheres of exchange, he or she remains objectively enthralled to commodity fetishism qua the inverting of precedence between producing subjects and produced objects. Put differently, under capitalism, relations between persons as socially laboring producers really are, they do not merely seem to be, they really are determined by relations between things as exchange relations between competing commodities. The Marxist critic can read fetishism's quote-unquote social hieroglyphic, but so long as he or she is stuck within capitalism, he or she can only keep reading and rereading this, nothing more. This same 1859 textual occasion also points towards Marx's subsequent identification of IBC as the pinnacle of commodity fetishism in the third volume of Capital. The money at stake at this point in 1859's A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy would be currency specifically in its function as commanding a rate of interest based on its omnipresent potential in capitalism to serve as capital, namely as potentially generative of surplus value once released into capitalism's circuit of MCM prime, that is, money, commodities, more money. Soon after the Fetishism of the Commodity and its Secret in Capital Volume 1, Marx identifies the quote-unquote riddle of the money fetish, this shiny and glittering quote-unquote magic of money, as the key to, quote, the riddle of the commodity fetish now become visible and dazzling to our eyes, end quote, through gold and silver currencies. So, what for the Marx of both A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy and Das Kapital, what makes money, the commodity par excellence as the universal equivalent, an even more striking manifestation of the perverted appearance that is capitalistic fetishism? Even before Marx focuses on IBC, he identifies, also in Capital Volume 3, a fashion in which money sustains illusions concealing the true intensity of oppression and extortion under capitalism. As is well known, Marx distinguishes between surplus value and profit, with the latter as only a portion of the former. In addition to the capitalist profit, some of which he or she consumes and much of which he or she reinvests, surplus value also is divided into landowners' rent, government's taxes, and financiers' interest. The rates of surplus value and profit are calculated differently. The rate of surplus value is the prime of MCM prime, measured against only the variable capital of the capitalist total capital. This total capital consists of constant capital in addition to variable capital. The rate of profit, by contrast, is the prime of MCM prime measured against the total capital. Hence, the rate of profit always will appear lower than the rate of surplus value. Yet, the latter is the real measure of the exploitation of labor by capital. This exploitation thus gets diluted, diminished, and dissimulated by a foregrounding of the rate of profit instead. Moreover, the rate of profit deceptively makes it seem as though the total capital, including constant capital, generates surplus value. Hence, money as M prime viewed as profit vis-a-vis total capital, rather than as surplus value vis-a-vis variable capital only, whitewashes capital's injustices. One aspect of capital is money as self-laundering. In Chapter 23 of Part 5 of Capital Volume 3, Marx compares interest and profit. In this context, profit qua quote-unquote profit of enterprise is associated by Marx with quote-unquote wages of superintendence. Both profit of enterprise and wages of superintendence are portions of capital-appropriated surplus value that misleadingly are made to present the capitalist not as a non-laboring owner of capital, but as a laborer earning his or her fair share of income through specific forms of work, such as researching market trends, courting investors, planning business strategies, overseeing and managing his or her employees, and the like. The capitalist qua capitalist, as the mere bearer or personification of capital's logic of MCM prime, is a non-working possessor of the means of production and a buyer of the labor power of others. The execution of enterprising and or superintending labors, even when carried out by the person who also bears or personifies capital, are not performed by the capitalist qua capitalist, namely, insofar as he or she is an owner of the means of production. Through profit of enterprise, the specifically capitalistic character of the capitalist, as representative of MCM prime, is, one could say, repressed. Relatedly, given that profit of enterprise as profit still is a portion of surplus value, This profit is derived by the capitalist from the unpaid labor time of those he or she hires and exploits as variable capital, and not from his or her own labor of whatever sort. Profit of enterprise and wages of superintendents could be said to repress the fact that capitalists expropriate the fruits of the labor of others. These obfuscating repackagings of surplus labor and the quota of profit it contains do so by passing off capitalists as themselves laborers engaged in different but equally laborious work, planning, overseeing, etc., alongside the rest of their workers. Quote, "The labor of exploiting is just as much labor as the labor that is exploited," end quote. Yet, as Marx notes at this very same moment in the third volume of Capital, the thereby repressed truth of capital's non-laboring extraction of surplus value from labor returns in the guise of the quantum of interest, inevitably accompanying the profit disguised as profit of enterprise and wages of superintendents. Prior to me unpacking the significance of IBC in the historical materialist critical analysis of capitalism, I should make two observations with implications for what ensues below. First, the deceiving division between profit of enterprise and interest is rendered even more deceptive, intending to become manifest as a split between two seemingly separate groups of capitalists, namely financial or money capitalists who receive interest, and industrial or commercial capitalists who receive profit. Industrial capitalists easily can appear to be productive themselves through their close connection to processes of producing commodities through industry by laborers. These capitalists therefore look as though they deservedly earn what is presented as their profit of enterprise and/or wages of superintendents. Financial capitalists, by contrast with industrial capitalists, more glaringly display capital's separateness from labor's productivity, in that they reap their rewards without themselves having any direct hand in the productive enterprises to which they lend their money. Bankers, speculators, and their ilk more readily come to enjoy the unsavory reputation of getting something for nothing. Yet, such is the fundamental but inconvenient truth of all capitalists, whether financiers, industrialists, or whatever, and even of capital in general. Capital gets something, that is, surplus value, from which is generated both the industrialist profit and the financier's interest. Capital gets something for nothing, with surplus value as unpaid labor. The vulture-like speculative investor, scorned for contributing nothing to the quote-unquote real economy, while vampirically siphoning off money in the form of interest, is the symptom embodying the truth of capital as inherently exploitative. The second observation I wish to put forward before delving into the details of IBC a la Marx has to do with the parallels I insinuate above between Marx's critique of political economy and psychoanalysis via talk of repression. More precisely, in what immediately precedes, I deploy a pair of correlations. On the one hand, I associate profit of enterprise, wages of superintendents, and industrial capitalists with repression. This Verdrängung conceals the fact that capital, organized around surplus value as the source of all profit, interest, rent, and taxes under capitalism, exists solely through getting something for nothing via its unequal but still perfectly legal exchange with labor. On the other hand, interest in financial capitalists are associated by me, following Marx's own indications, with the return of this same repressed. Yet, the Marxian theorization of interest I'm about to reconstruct suggests that interest, as the return of the repressed, itself even more potently represses in turn the very fact initially repressed under the veneer of the industrial capitalist profit of enterprise and wages of superintendents. In this case, it seems that the return of the repressed is not even a practically inefficacious intellectual acceptance of the repressed as per psychoanalysis. Rather, with IBC in relation to other forms of capital, the return of the repressed strangely reinforces the original repression itself. Or, in the manner of a Hegelian-style convergence of opposites, the moment of clearest revelation, that is, the return of the repressed, coincides with that of the most obscuring concealment, namely a redoubling of the initial repression. Perhaps, as per one of the lessons of Poe's The Purloined Letter dear to Lacan, the best way to hide, indeed, is in plain sight. When discussing IBC in the third volume of Capital, Marx repeatedly emphasizes its status as the very peak and quintessence of the fetishism first delineated in Volume 1. Marx defines IBC in the opening chapter of Part 5 of Capital Volume 3 as money functioning as itself a peculiar type of commodity. With all commodities combining both use value and exchange value, IBC is money which, as potential capital, has the use value of potentially producing more exchange value than it itself initially embodies prior to being employed in the process of MCM prime. That is to say, it is money with the use value of promising to generate exchange value that contains surplus value. The rate of interest paid by the borrower to the lender represents the market price of IBC's distinctive use value of yielding surplus value. This is the essence of IBC as per Marx. The opening paragraph of chapter 24, still in part 5 of volume 3, compares and contrasts the elementary formula for capital as industrial or commercial capital, MCM prime, with the formula for financial or money capital as IBC, MM prime. With MCM prime, there are, as Marx notes, two separate stages forming the elementary nucleus of the structural dynamic at the heart of capitalism. First, there is the sequence MC, in which the capitalist uses his or her money, M, to buy or invest in commodities, C, as both variable capital and constant capital. Second, there is the sequence CM prime, in which the capitalist puts the commodities, C, produced by his or her combined variable and constant capital, into circulation on the marketplace. If all goes according to plan, these commodities realize exchange values containing amounts of surplus value, M prime, accruing to the capitalist. Both MC and CM prime bring persons into producing and exchanging relationships with each other. In MC, capitalist buyers come into contact with sellers of various commodities. In CM prime, capitalists, their agents, and middlemen come into contact with buyers of commodities. Thus, with MCM prime as combining the two phases of MC and CM prime, relations between persons remain palpable parts of the movement of capital as industrial or commercial capital. The fetishism at work within this sort of capital does not completely eclipse the social behind the facade of the thingly. Therefore, it amounts to an incomplete fetishism as per the Marxian definition of commodity fetishism in the first volume of Das Kapital. But with IBC's abbreviated capitalistic circuit of MM prime, commodity fetishism is brought to its perfection and purity through the social being totally and completely obliterated by the thingly. With IBC, money as the commodity par excellence seems to detach from persons altogether, in looking as though it becomes an independent, auto-reflexive automaton, an inhuman self-relating mechanism. With the transition from industrial to finance capital, the residual relations between persons in MC and CM prime are totally obscured behind the appearance of relations between things. More exactly, the eclipsing factor here is the solipsistic self-relation of one thing in particular, namely money as the commodity standing in for all other commodities. From the summit of the capitalist fetishistic insanity as reversal, Verrücktheit of social reality, and as with the Feuerbachian religious believer, of property of subjects qua persons is misattributed to objects qua things. Specifically, the property of producing surplus value is misattributed from labor to capital, even more precisely from labor power to IBC. According to the Marxist critique of political economy, labor power is the one and only commodity amongst all other commodities with the strange capacity to produce more exchange values than this labor power itself costs in exchange values, that is, labor's wages, for its production and reproduction, or we could say its maintenance and subsistence. Yet, under the distorting influence of capitalistic fetishism, this capacity of laboring persons is ascribed to a thing, money as IBC with its MM prime instead. Only labor power is generative of surplus value. But in the guise of interest, money now appears to the subjects of capitalism as the unique commodity enjoying the power to be self-generative of surplus value. Commodity fetishism's inversion between persons and things is here finalized in being brought to its maximum 180-degree point, as Marx himself declares several times. Indeed, if fetishism is for Marx a form of inverting alienation, then IBC is, quote, the most estranged and peculiar form, end quote, of the fetishistic commodity of capital. Marx, earlier in the same paragraph I have been relying upon implicitly in the past few minutes of chapter 29 of Capital, Volume 3, in which Marx describes IBC as the quote-unquote climax of commodity fetishism, Marx speaks of, quote, interest-bearing capital always being the mother of every insane form, end quote. Based on the ground covered above, one sense of Marx's wording here should be obvious. IBC is the mother of every insane form, qua the ultimate, fullest instance of commodity fetishism. However, in another sense, Marx's identification of IBC as maternal should provoke puzzlement. Why? Both IBC and the broader economic categories of financial and fictitious capital are later developments in the history of capitalism, chronologically subsequent to the commodity form itself, and hence to commodity fetishism too. Yet, the Marx of the third volume of Das Kapital depicts IBC as giving birth to this capitalistic fetishism. This looks to be an extremely strange case of a mother who somehow gives birth to her ancestors. An odd retroactive temporality of some sort or another appears to be operative in Marx's theory of interest. Marx, already in 1844, situates the interest-dealing systems of credit and banking as quote-unquote consummations of capitalism's development. That is to say, the institutionalization of interest is a later stage in the evolution of capitalism. However, as Michael Heinrich contends, there is a historical inevitability to the emergence of IBC once the capitalist mode of production arises and takes hold. In Finance Capital, Rudolf Hilferding observes, quote, in capitalist society, every sum of money takes on the character of capital, end quote. Duncan Foley renders this observation more precise in explaining that, quote, once the interest rate emerges as a social fact, every agent in capitalist society is compelled to view money as potentially expanding value, end quote. In other words, as soon as IBC surfaces within the temporal unfurling of capital, IBC's fashion of making money a commodity comes to color every little bit and piece of the universal equivalent right down to single pennies. All money now shows itself to be potential IBC. Every fraction of currency promises to yield at least the going rate of interest, if nothing else. As Heinrich notes in this connection, quote, money is now potential capital, end quote. Similarly, Henrik Grossman remarks that, quote, in the language of the banker, everything is capital, end quote. Returning once more to Capital Volume 3, Marx therein posits the anteriority of the category of surplus value to that of interest. Alluding to the dialectics of quantity and quality in Hegelian logic, he argues that what starts as a purely quantitative division of surplus value, here into quotas of profit and interest, mutates into a qualitative distinction. This qualitative distinction is that between, on the one hand, directly productive or functioning capital as industrial or commercial capital associated with profit, and on the other hand, indirectly productive or functioning capital as financial or money capital associated with interest. The quality of the difference between profit and interest is further enhanced by the tendency for two corresponding but distinct groups of capitalists to congeal, namely the productive capitalists of industry and commerce with their profit, and the unproductive capitalists of banking and finance with their interest. In the wake of the quantitative become qualitative splitting up of surplus value, interest seems to autonomize itself. IBC separates off from the rest of capital. In so doing, quote, interest appears as a surplus value that capital yields in and of itself, and which it would therefore yield even without productive application, end quote. MM prime comes to look independent of MCM prime. But looks are deceiving. IBC's independence is illusory, although this illusion has very real power in capitalism. Money is not a fantastical golden egg that lays additional golden eggs. The commodity fetishist experience of IBC as the magically self-enhancing circuit of MM prime, of money as auto-productive of surplus value ex nihilo, is denounced as ridiculous by Marx with straightforward objections. Under capitalism, both profit and interest are portions of surplus value. Hence, profit and interest can exist only if there initially is surplus value. One cannot defensively derive the categories of surplus value and profit from that of interest, since interest and profit are, in actuality, both subcategories of surplus value. Furthermore, as Marx himself points out, the economics of the rate of interest limit the number of capitalists who can retire from productive industrial activity and become financiers, speculators, etc., living off interest payments alone. According to Marx, the supply of and demand for finance capital determines the rate of interest as the price of IBC, qua money used to make more money. If too many capitalists try to be financial or money capitalists, then the glut of IBC on markets so drastically reduces the rate of interest as to push a critical mass of these capitalists back into being industrial or commercial capitalists. This alone makes it impossible for the entirety of the class of capitalists to live as rentiers. Additionally, the very definition of IBC as peculiar to capitalism in being dependent upon productive capital's circuit, MCM prime, means that without this circuit, there cannot be any IBC strictly speaking. Put differently, if IBC's MM prime is derivative of MCM prime, then all capitalists cannot withdraw from the movement of the latter. If nobody is engaged in capital's MCM prime, then nobody can engage in capitalistic MM prime either. Yet as Marx acknowledges, the mirage of IBC's self-valorizing autonomy persists. What is more, commodity fetishism, specifically as reaching its most intensive and extensive realization in and through the advent of IBC, thoroughly inverts this truth. This fetishism goes so far as to make it seem as though profit, and along with it the entirety of surplus value, is generated from capital's supposedly original self-enhancing power as MM prime, money making money. Not only is interest independent of profit and surplus value, the latter are produced by the former. The species appears as the genus and vice versa. The parasite looks to be the host and vice versa. Labor's valorization of capital's materials now seems to be the self-valorization of material capital, up to and including the strange stuff that is money in its various guises. The fetishistic inversion of the paired positions of objective things and subjective persons here arrives at its most extreme endpoint. IBC also perfects the other major dimension of commodity fetishism as per the fetishism of the commodity and its secret, in addition to fetishistic Verdinglichung, that is, the reifying thingification of social relations. This other major dimension is that of fetishism's mistaking of exchange value for use value. Exhibit A of the fetishist confusion of exchange with use value would have to be gold as the commodity par excellence, insofar as it epitomizes money as the universal equivalent of all commodities. Marx, employing instead pearls and diamonds as examples of fetishized commodities, explains in a way that mocks the commodity fetishist, especially the professional capitalist economist, quote, "So far, no chemist has ever discovered exchange value either in a pearl or a diamond. The economists who have discovered this chemical substance and who lay special claim to critical acumen nevertheless find that the use value of material objects belongs to them independently of their material properties, while their value, on the other hand, forms a part of them as objects. What confirms them in this view is the peculiar circumstance that the use value of a thing is realized without exchange, that is, in the direct relation between the thing and man, while inversely, its value is realized only in exchange, that is, in a social process," end quote. In neither gold, nor pearls, nor diamonds, nor any other commodity qua material entity will anyone ever find the supposed subtle, sublime substance responsible for material things' social exchange values. Even the most powerful electron microscopes will fail to detect the mysterious, magical exchange value particles woven into the physical makeup of commodities. Any hunt for the economic equivalent of the God particle is forever doomed to failure in advance. As the commodity par excellence, money is especially susceptible to capitalistic fetishization. Here, too, IBC, as per Capital Volume 3, amounts to the maximization of commodity fetishism. How so? A less than maximal fetishization of money would entail erroneously envisioning the exchange value of currency as having something to do with the currency's embodiment in metallic coins, paper bills, and the like. Such everyday fetishization, common to ordinary consumers, assumes the existence of a spectral exchangeability stuff hidden within the metal, paper, etc. of cash. The maximal fetishization of money as IBC goes beyond this more mundane, subdued fetishism of mere currency. As regards commodity fetishism vis-a-vis money specifically, a distinction helpfully can be drawn between the cash fetishism of the consumer versus the interest fetishism of the capitalist. The cash fetishism of the consumer in the marketplace is limited to misclassifying simple exchange value qua social as a species of the genus use value qua material. By contrast, the interest fetishism of lending and borrowing capitalists, the fetishism of IBC, not only misattributes exchange value to money qua thing, it goes so far as to misattribute the very power to generate surplus value to monetary material. MM' signifies this more extreme misattribution peculiar to the interest fetishism of capitalists. Money now not only contains magical exchange stuff, but also super magical self-multiplying stuff. More than merely a special sort of inert object, it is a special sort of spontaneously auto-reflexive and self-enhancing subject. What is more, this interest fetishism comes to entwine itself with the cash fetishism of consumers. These consumers thereby are led to see the money they have to spend on goods for their subsistence as squandered potential capital. The interest fetishism of IBC adds insult to injury. Under the shadow of finance capital's interest-driven regime, Capitalism's consumers are made to feel guilty for being forced by their low earnings to spend everything on consumption rather than to accumulate with an eye to becoming capitalists themselves. It is their own fault if they fail to rise into the ranks of the bourgeoisie. If only they were abstinent enough to save and invest. Shame on them. At this point, I wish to have brief recourse to the Freudian concept of screen memories in connection with IBC as per Capital Volume 3. This recourse is motivated by the fact that screen memories, as per Freud, involve two features also crucial to Marx's account of IBC. First, a Freudian screen memory, like interest as the crowning form of commodity fetishism, a Freudian screen memory simultaneously reveals and conceals a repressed truth, this combination of revelation with concealment being an essential feature of the distinctively psychoanalytic concept of the symptom. Second, such a memory is shaped by the temporal dynamic Freud labels Nachträglichkeit, namely deferred action qua retroaction, or in French, après coup. These two features are essential ingredients of Marx's theory of IBC too. Moreover, Lacan himself treats the fetish object of the analytic fetishist as a type of screen memory, and you will find this particularly in Seminar 4. As seen, Marx implies that IBC entails a retroactivity. Although this type of interest is a later development of capitalism as it enters into its financial and fictitious stages, IBC's eventual surfacing sweepingly transforms not only elements of capitalism contemporaneous with this surfacing, but features of the historical past too. Perhaps the most famous instance of retroactivity in Marx's corpus is the line from the 1857 introduction to the Grundrisse, according to which, quote, "Human anatomy contains a key to the anatomy of the ape. The intimations of higher development among the subordinate animal species, however, can be understood only after the higher development is already known," end quote. As I argue above, IBC is specific to capitalism and thus different from merchant and consumer credit, as well as from pre-capitalist forms of money lending. Nevertheless, IBC, through its distorting effects on commodity fetishist perspectives, portrays itself as continuous with non-IBC interest. Under the influence of capitalist commodity fetishism, as reaching its apogee with IBC, and paraphrasing a line from the concluding paragraph of Freud's 1899 essay, Screen Memories, memories relating to pre-capitalist economics may be all that capitalism subjects possess, rather than memories actually from earlier modes of production. IBC retroactively renders non-IBC interest as the ape, anticipating itself, IBC, as the ape-descended human. Of course, the false eternalization through naturalization of what in truth is historically transitory and socially peculiar is the hallmark gesture of ideology as per Marxist materialism. Hence, IBC's just explained establishment of a misleading continuity between itself and pre-capitalist varieties of interest, a continuity purportedly traversing all socioeconomic systems, is ideological insofar as it operates so as falsely to eternalize and naturalize various money-lending practices, its own first and foremost. Obviously, neither money lending nor money itself are natural and eternal, no matter how long established they have been in the history of human societies. Moreover, interest ought to be extremely difficult for ideology to naturalize. The circuit MM' appears to amount to a fantastical power of creation ex nihilo on the part of an inorganic product of human artifice. What could be less natural in the various senses of this adjective? Yet, with commodity fetishism as the quote-unquote religion of everyday life within capitalism, all of these quoted phrases are Marx's, the, quote, metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties, end quote, of MM' are somehow miraculously rendered, quote-unquote, extremely obvious and, quote-unquote, trivial. Moreover, these subtleties and niceties are very real abstractions, namely, quote-unquote, mystic creations produced by and forming integral parts of the quote-unquote earthly kernel of the capitalist mode of production and the social structures resting upon it. With the acceptance of IBC, itself the exhaustive culmination of commodity fetishism, with the acceptance of IBC as natural and eternal, it comes to seem banal and self-evident that commodified things and not socially producing persons automatically self-generate values. The world gets turned truly upside down. IBC completes and universalizes this inversion. It gives birth to the wholly fetishized capitalistic universe. And with capitalist production, exchange, and consumption exponentially expanded, intensified, and accelerated, thanks to the fuel of financial capital, IBC and its ilk proved to be potent enhancers and reinforcers of commodity fetishism. Capitalist interest is indeed the mother of every insane form. Thank you.
Anybody?
Thanks, Adrian. That's fantastic. Just a sort of quick question, I suppose, or footnote is, I was wondering, is there any sense in which you think that phrase, the mother of every insane form, and particularly the use of the word mother in this context, is also an allusion to Aristotle's philosophy of money, and particularly his philosophy of crematistics and usury, and this idea that money, by its very nature, is sterile. It cannot reproduce or reproduce itself.
Yes.
So we have a kind of perverse mother figure here in the form of this thing that you call IBC. And just as a footnote to that really is this debate over the nature of money and the reproductive or non-reproductive nature of money, to follow up your point about the retroactive nature of this debate, it really does go all the way back to Aristotle, because the original word for interest is tokos, which is offspring, because the original form of interest was actually cattle. You know, I lend you my cattle for the winter, then you give me them back plus the lambs or the sheep, you know, in the spring. Thanks very much. That's just a comment.
Well, I should say that you are absolutely correct. There is also an intended reference to Aristotle and to the discussion of crematistics in the Politics, and that this surfaces often without Aristotle being named as such, although occasionally Marx does. But usually he doesn't make that explicit. But at the same time, Marx, in terms of his implicit and explicit references back to Aristotle, Marx himself, I think, is aware of walking an extremely fine line between maintaining a historically conscious critical perspective that seeks to focus on interest as it features within the capitalist mode of production, and hence its distinctive peculiarities within this modern mode of production. While nonetheless, yes, acknowledging that there is, I'm not sure if I would want to say that it is transhistorical in the strong sense of eternal, but at least, the deep history of interest, that takes us all the way back to, the ancient Greek context circa 400 BC, and even earlier, of course. And Marx, of course, this balancing act is, I quoted from, among other places, the 1857 introduction to the Grundrisse. Toward the end of that, Marx, does indicate that for historical materialism, it is equally important to keep in view constants that cut across the various modes of production, both pre-modern and modern, but at the same time, not to lose sight of the distinctive features of capitalism. And, of course, when we're talking about interest in the pre-modern context, its two primary forms, as Marx specifies without referring directly to Aristotle, would be, money lent to merchants who engage in buying and selling within the sphere of exchange, and then money lent to consumers for the purchasing of things in the sphere of exchange, then to be, brought into the private sphere of consumption. And that for Marx, IBC is distinctive in that it is interest as pertaining to the sphere of production as distinct from the spheres of exchange and consumption. And so, there he wants to say, let's look at, this aspect of it as not adequately captured. It couldn't be captured by someone like Aristotle simply because Aristotle didn't live to see the dawn of the sort of economic infrastructure that we live within and on the basis of. But yes, and I should also say too, on the one hand, I'm very sympathetic to certain approaches. The most famous example here would be the late David Graeber's relatively recent book, on the 5,000-year history of debt. And I think those deep histories are incredibly valuable. Yet at the same time, I worry that, in treating this as one single continuous, institution, practice, phenomenon, et cetera, that, again, as an old-fashioned Marxist historical materialist, certain things are going to drop out of the picture that are, peculiar and singular apropos capitalism, including how interest functions. And moreover, I should say, one way of responding to this is, remember, for Aristotle, crematistics appears as a fringe, marginal phenomenon, right? It's not, the dominant mode of economy is oikos in terms of the management of the household, et cetera, and then there are these outlying perverts for whom, simply accumulating more money becomes, rather than a means to an end in itself. And basically, you could say that the continuity can be acknowledged here, but at the same time, we could say that what is an exception for Aristotle becomes the rule under capitalism, right? And so that's another way to think about the basic mutation between pre-modern and modern forms of interest here along Marx's lines.
Yep. Can you hear me, Adrian?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you very much. I just very briefly take what you said further and say that I think that the mother of all insane forms, a wonderful line you picked out, works even according to the Seminar 4 definition of fetishism.
Yeah.
Insofar as the mother's the one who has her own signifier within her, and so, anyway, it just works perfectly. But the direction I want to go was, you didn't elaborate too much, but the first connection that you drew between Marxism and psychoanalysis, apropos of repression.
Yes.
I do wonder how you square this with Lacan's discussions of creatio ex nihilo in Seminar 7, and in particular, I think that the thesis is confirmed, in fact, that creatio ex nihilo is actually most characteristic of capitalism. But more specifically, you've associated it with repression, whereas he, of course, associates it with sublimation, which is satisfaction in the absence of repression, at least according to what he accepts at that time. And so I actually suspect, in this case, it's an inconsistency on the part of Lacan. I think it's some of the weaker material, but I do have to wonder if Antigone is the mother of all insane forms. Anyway, thank you.
Well, I should say, apropos Lacan's readings of Marx. So, for example, in both seminars 4 and 5, he does, spend quite a bit of time talking about fetishism between Marxism and psychoanalysis well before his better-known, prompted by May 68 and its aftermath, sustained engagements with Marx and the Marxist tradition, starting in texts like Seminar 16 and onward, right? But one of the motivations for what I'm doing here is that whenever Lacan talks about commodity fetishism a la Marx, like so many others, it's clear that he is limiting his consideration of it to how Marx spells it out in Capital Volume 1 in the famous chapter on the fetishism of the commodity and its secret. And I've seen no evidence, and I've combed through all of Lacan to look for it, no evidence that he had at least an intimate familiarity with Capital Volume 3. And there's not a peep from him about, for example, the fact that Marx says it's not until we're dealing with the category of interest, specifically as interest-bearing capital, that we see the fullest, you might say, development or flowering of what he first identifies in Capital Volume 1 as commodity fetishism. And I think there are interesting consequences, and whether Lacan himself would have changed his tune on certain points, like what he might have to say about creation ex nihilo in connection with Marx on interest, well, we can only hypothesize because he never addresses it. I think because he really was focused just on Capital Volume 1 when dealing with the mature Marx's critique of political economy. But another thing that this is an extract from a forthcoming book, it'll appear next year, entitled Infinite Greed, The Inhuman Selfishness of Capital. One of the things that I discovered while working on Marx for this project is that, Lacan, of course, in Seminar 18 famously credits Marx with inventing the psychoanalytic symptom avant la lettre, right? But I think that there, Lacan was a little too uncharitable with Marx, because Marx, I think, not only anticipated the analytic concept of the symptom, as Lacan rightly identifies, but in addition anticipates, for instance, the strictly Freudian conception of drive, Trieb, the manner in which the mature Marx uses the term Trieb in connection especially with the repetitive looping of the basic circuit of capital as MCM prime. If you go and comb through the volumes of Capital as well as theories of surplus value and related texts, with a psychoanalytically informed eye, you will be shocked to find a number of incredibly prescient anticipations of what then Freud develops in terms of his metapsychological concept of Trieb, strictly speaking. And likewise, too, I think, with the manner in which socio-ideological repressions, obfuscations, sublimations, etc. function, that it's almost as though Marx discovers at the very heart of the capitalist economy the working at an anonymous, impersonal, socio-structural level of structures and dynamics, which then psychoanalysis, perhaps not coincidentally, just a few decades later, starts to unearth at the level of the libidinal economy as supposedly distinct from political economy. And so part of this project, too, is to look at how, and of course the standard Marxism with psychoanalysis rapprochement focuses on Marxist analyses of superstructural phenomena rather than infrastructural ones. But if instead you look at remarrying those two on the basis of a consideration of the mature Marx's infrastructural analyses qua critique of political economy, all of a sudden the number of anticipations of psychoanalysis multiply well beyond just the symptom. And so that's also part of what I'm trying to bring out here. But yes, it doesn't square exactly with Lacan on creation ex nihilo as per Seminar 7, but here I would say that's in part perhaps because had Lacan closely examined Volume 3 of Capital, he might very well have arrived at some of this himself, or not.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you for illuminating perspective on capitalism as such, because everybody now knows how crazy financial and speculative capitalism is. This is in clear blue sky, whereas we somehow forget that capitalism initially is problematic in a way. You don't have to answer, but I had one association. You were using two metaphors. Mother giving birth to its ancestors and parasite looking like a host.
Yes.
Isn't it? So I was struck that you didn't mention this obvious philosophical parallel, but later on I somehow understood why, because it would lead us to wrong way in a way. It's Hegel, of course, positing the presupposition.
Yes.
So, but this gives the illusion that there's a subject who posits, and that's precisely what you wanted to somehow deconstruct in a way.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And the simple answer is yes.
So, this is the end of the first session. We are continuing at 5 p.m. with Alenka Zupancic, and this is going to be the final lecture today. Thank you, Adrian, again.
Well, thank you. Thank you.